off him. He was used to people, as an administrator, he was used to people disagreeing with him, and he felt this was just another little storm in a teacup.
But this storm refused to die down. The owners of Chelmsford heard of the meeting and pushed for the treatment to stop. By early 1979, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Heron had finally and reluctantly abandoned any further attempts at deep sleep treatment at Chelmsford. In 1980, after 7 years of legal battles, Barry Hart successfully sued Dr. Heron for $60,000 for wrongful treatment. And slowly the Chelmsford scandal came under official scrutiny, with Dr. Bailey being charged with the manslaughter of Miriam Podio, a charge that was later dropped, and the reopening of the inquests on Audrey Francis and John Adams. Unsuccessful attempts were made to have the Chelmsford doctors banned from medical practice. Finally, in 1988, the government announced a royal commission to thoroughly investigate the affair. After 2.5 years of deliberations, the commissioner made strong recommendations about the Chelmsford doctors.
The commissioner said about the death of Audrey Francis that Dr. Heron seemed unwilling or unable to accept the overwhelming evidence of the experts that DST was directly linked to and responsible for Miss Francis's death. Then, in relation to the death of John Adams, concerning Dr. Gill, the commissioner said Dr. Gill was totally inexperienced in the application of DST and in the drugs used in the regime. What he did to John Adams amounted to an irresponsible experiment. He was abysmally ignorant of the interaction and potentiation of the drugs he prescribed. He was, in my opinion, grossly negligent in his treatment of John Adams. Dealing with Miriam Podio, who involved the 3 doctors, or actually 4 doctors, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Heron, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Gill, the Royal Commissioner said that Dr. Gardner accepted the responsibility. He then said Dr. Heron and Dr. Gill had reservations about doing so. Their attitude demands severe criticism. Both were involved in her treatment and were significantly responsible for her death. All 3 were guilty of neglect to the most serious level.
Pretty strong criticisms.
Oh, extremely strong, yes.
In spite of the Royal Commission's findings, 18 months on, Dr. Heron, Dr. Gardner, and Dr. Gill are still practicing as doctors today. At first, Dr. Heron agreed to be interviewed for this program, but then changed his mind. Dr. Heron told us that he sees himself as a victim of Chelmsford, having suffered from what he describes as a witch hunt. He told us that patients were never in deep coma. They were always rousable. They were never given ECT when awake. I would give an anaesthetic if there was any doubt whatsoever, he said. Dr. Heron argued that the treatment at Chelmsford was very similar to that carried out by Sir William Sargent in England. But Sargent's patients were aroused 3 times a day for meals. At Chelmsford, they were kept so deep they had to be fed through tubes.
Would you like to comment on the deaths that happened at Chelmsford, Dr. Heron?
Dr. Gardner would not be interviewed on camera, but he did agree to talk. He's the only one of the Chelmsford doctors who now accepts that the deep sleep treatment was responsible for deaths at Chelmsford. On ECT, he said, because they were in a coma, I saw no reason to give an anaesthetic. But Dr. Gardner now agrees that with hindsight, it is possible that sometimes patients could have been awake during ECT.
Hello, is that Dr. Gill?
Yeah.
Do you think you made any errors of judgment?
I don't know that I don't think I made significant errors of judgment, put it that way.
Dr. Gill described the Royal Commission as a disgrace. He said the Commissioner's comments on his role in Miriam Podio's death were disgraceful and disgusting. John Adams' death was, he said, an unfortunate accident. Dr. Gill said that the 24 suicides linked with deep sleep therapy were outstanding psychiatric results. And what of Dr. Bailey? As the pressures increased on him over Chelmsford, Bailey's mental health deteriorated. In a bizarre episode in the late 70s, Dr. Heron had Bailey admitted to Chelmsford and given his own deep sleep treatment, apparently without Bailey's knowledge. 6 years later, in 1985, on the eve of court action against him by a former patient, Bailey's despair at his predicament had been heightened by a letter from his old hero, Sir William Sargent to Bailey's lawyer, in which Sargent firmly rejected Bailey's technique of deep sedation and feeding through tubes. It was the same technique that he, Sargent, had abandoned in the 1930s after the deaths of 2 of his patients. Sargent said, "If I'd come over to Australia to give evidence on oath, I would have found myself supporting the prosecution and not the defence." After learning of Sargent's letter, Bailey drove out of Sydney, parked on a lonely dirt track, and committed suicide with barbiturates and alcohol. In a final note he wrote, "I've had enough. I learned today that they've sent police to London to interview Sargent. Always remember that the forces of evil are greater than the forces of good."
Because we're putting 6 lesions in the brain, 3 on each side. And when the people were picking for this operation had been really the bottom of the can. Nothing's going to help. Shoot them,